Thank you so much, Jamie, and thank you, British Library, for this beautiful space and building and research and all of the wonders that they have back there in the main library. And thank you all for coming out on a Sunday morning. Even the morning music was packed, and many apologies for those of you who couldn't get into some of the sessions. But remember, in this whole thing of making a choice, and it's all about making a choice. But you can still catch many of the sessions online when you go back home. Presently, it's on the British Library website, as many of you know, and you'd pay 10 quid, or maybe your ticket covers that. But after a week, it goes free, so you can watch all of these sessions. Absolute honor to have Sir Venki with us. This is an absolute brilliant book. It arrived on my table a couple of weeks ago, and at that point of time, I had no idea that we're going to be in conversation with Venki. We were trying to get somebody else more learned, but I started reading it, and it was absolutely fascinating. And I was so glad that when my colleagues sort of said that, "Will you do it?" I said, "Absolutely." So straight off, Sir Venki, the Egyptians, it all starts with the Egyptians, inevitably.
Well, the book does.
Yeah, well, the book does. And they were so fascinated with dying and death.
Yeah, so the Egyptians are just one example. I think Stephen Cave, the philosopher who's now works in Cambridge, wrote a book called Immortality. And he says that humans have been obsessed with mortality ever since we became aware of it. And the point is that we may be the only species that's aware of mortality. Other animals may know about death. They know when one of theirs has died, but they don't know that they have a fixed lifespan and that they're all going to die one day, no matter what happens. And because humans somehow figured that out, and then we are able to communicate it to subsequent generations, we're the only species with this awareness. And because it's so terrifying in a way that you're no longer going to exist, a lot of human culture is about denying death. So, for example, the Egyptians would do this fancy burial of their pharaohs and surround the pharaoh with all his possessions and so on, and then put it all in a tomb that nobody was supposed to see. What was the purpose? Well, the purpose was that one day the pharaoh would be resurrected and pass some sort of test, and then if he passed the test, he would go on to some eternal life. And I think all cultures have evolved some sort of view that death is a transformation into something else and not final. And so that is how it is. And so you can think of Plan A. This is Stephen Cave's classification. Plan A is to avoid dying. You know, this is sort of the Woody Allen idea, where he said, "I don't want to live on through my fans. I want to live on in my apartment." You know, so anyway. So that's Plan A. Plan B is that, well, you might die, but you will be bodily resurrected one day. And that's the Abrahamic religions, Jews, Muslims, and Christians, all traditionally wanted to bury their dead because of this belief that, you know, one day on the day of judgment, you know, you'd be bodily resurrected. And then Eastern religions think, well, the body may disappear, but you'll have an immortal soul that can occupy other bodies, and so on. And then a Plan D is, well, even if none of this happens, you may live on through your works or your monuments or your reputation. You could build pyramids, or you could compose great works of music or literature and somehow live on. And so that's how we've dealt with death. But with modern science, I think Plan A is coming into the fore, which is simply trying to avoid dying.
But what happens when we die? Because our organs, you start transplanting into other people. Our cells continue to live.
Yeah.
So what dies? The root, the soul?
So it is an odd thing that when we think of death, we're thinking only of a particular kind of death. Because when we're alive, millions of cells in us are dying all the time. And we don't even notice it. And in fact, many of those cells are required to die. It's part of normal biology. If they didn't die, we'd have a problem. And so that's one side of the story. The other side is what you pointed out, that when we die, most of our cells are still alive. In fact, entire organs are alive, and you can donate your organs to a transplant recipient if you write it in your driver's license or your will or something like that. And so what we mean by death is the inability to function as a coherent whole, as a whole unit, as an individual. And that's what we mean by dying. And that dying is a result of a critical systems failure. So if you lose an arm, you don't die, it's fine. I mean, that's not fine, but you're still alive, right? But if a critical system fails, like your heart or your brain, then the body is unable to function at all as a whole. And so it's this critical systems failure that's responsible for dying.
But in today's day and age, even if your heart fails, you can be given an artificial pumping heart.
Exactly.
So what is it, again, that dies that sort of allows us to say you're dead?
Well, if it's irreversible, for example, if your heart fails and you don't get a transplant right away, and you're not put on a heart-lung machine right away, then you'll die. And that's because the damage to your cellular systems is irreversible, so you can no longer get back to that state where you can function. And you raise an interesting point. So in previous times, if you didn't have a heartbeat, you would be considered dead. So there's that used to be the traditional idea, that you'd measure somebody's pulse. If they didn't have a pulse, they were effectively considered dead. And then people found out that you could actually resuscitate someone. You could do CPR, or in some cases you could immediately have them on a heart-lung machine and then have them get a transplant. So there'd be all sorts of ways in which that process was not final. So today, many countries define death by loss of brain activity. So it's essentially you have to be brain dead to be considered dead.
And that's pretty much keeping with some of the Eastern philosophies that your soul has transmuted somewhere, but you're actually just brain dead in a sense.
Right, well, perhaps. I'm a molecular biologist, so.
What was fascinating, Sir Venki, was that what you talk about, that every cell has life. Every cell is fairly complete. And the communication between the cells is what then creates who we are or what we are.
That's right. So we're really a collection of, not millions or billions, but trillions of cells. And it's that coordinate function of those cells to function as a unit is what defines us. And it's what gives us consciousness as well. So I think that's really what goes when we die.
And again, what was amazing was that every cell has a sense of when there's something that's foreign or not right, and how they then sort of look at that, and if I'm not mistaken, the protein cells then fold up to be able to consume the cell that's not right, or some such.
Well, okay, so let
unpack it.
So let's talk about the different levels at which biology functions. So at one level, you can think of life as a collection of molecules that work together. So inside cells, we have various types of molecules. One of them is DNA, which contains information required to make proteins. And it's these proteins, and it does that via an intermediary molecule called mRNA, which you all now know because we live in a post-COVID age. So DNA contains what you might call the information required to make this entire orchestra of proteins in the cell. These proteins carry out the thousands of functions in our cell, and they have to work in a harmonious way. You can think of them like an orchestra. You can't have a discordant or dysfunctional orchestra, or the thing isn't going to, it's not going to sound right. So that control is very important. Then, even after you've made the proteins, proteins have to be made, but they also have to be destroyed in a coordinated way, because you make the proteins when you need it, and you have to also destroy them when you don't need them. And this is all a highly controlled process. So that's another level that has to function. And then cells have organelles inside them. These organelles, some of them are responsible for providing energy, for coordinating many metabolic processes. Others are responsible for degrading or recycling defective components. And so those all have to function. And then at the cellular level, the cell itself has to live with other cells. There may be cells surrounding it in the tissue, or they may be communicating. There may be cells of the immune system. There may be neurons that fire in response to required actions by the brain. And so all of those things have to function. So you can see that you've got different levels of organization. It's not unlike, say, a society. A society consists of individuals, which may be grouped in families, and then maybe their little communities, and then you have a larger scale organization, like perhaps a company or a city, and then the whole thing together forms, say, a country, and that becomes part of some even bigger organization. So just as you have all these different levels of organization, life itself is organized at these different levels. And if you think of what causes death, it's the accumulation of damage that results in a critical system failure. But this accumulation of damage is what we call aging. And aging can occur at every one of these levels. At the level of DNA, it can affect the program of coordinating, of making proteins and coordinating the process. It can occur at the level of proteins, where you have proteins that are misfolded or don't function the way they're supposed to, all the way up to the level of tissues and the organism itself. And eventually it manifests itself in ways that are all too familiar. You know, if you're like me, you start losing hair, your joints ache, and things don't quite work as they used to. But it all starts at the molecular level, but goes on to these various...
So when are we programmed to die? I mean, mice and rats, flies and mosquitoes have a particular shelf life, as do the larger mammals, the whales and so on. So what's our how many of us here are senior citizens? Okay, so what do we have in store for us?
Yeah, so if you look at the variation in lifespan, it's extraordinary. So even among in the animal kingdom, you can have something like a mayfly, which lives only for a day. And then at the other end, you have something like the Greenland shark, which is a vertebrate and lives for 400 years. Or a bowhead whale lives for over 200 years. It's a mammal. And or a Galapagos tortoise can live for 200 plus years. And which raises the question that there's probably a Galapagos tortoise wandering around right now that could very well have encountered Darwin. Okay, so that's an amazing thought. So you have this huge variation of lifespan, and it's led to some mistaken ideas. You mentioned programming, for example. It led to the idea that, well, maybe each species is programmed to die, and the program's different for different species. It turns out, actually, what most biologists believe is there is no program. The only program of life, which is what evolution selects for, is something called fitness. Now, fitness doesn't mean the ability to run 100 meters. In biological terms, fitness means the ability to pass on your genes. Okay, how successful or how likely is it that you can successfully pass on your genes. So evolution is selected for fitness, and it doesn't care, as long as it selects for fitness, it doesn't care what happens later in life. So if you look at mammals, you'll find that on the whole, small animals live shorter lives than large animals. And you can explain this in evolutionary terms, because if you have a small animal like a mouse, which on average lives about 2 years or so, there's no evolutionary pressure to make that mouse live longer, for example, by investing a lot of biological resources into repairing and maintaining the individual mouse. And the reason is that individual mouse, long before it ages, is going to be eaten or starved to death or die of other causes. So it would be a waste of resources, biological resources, to put it into anti-aging, to prevent aging and have it live a long life. So rather, what evolution selects for in mice is the ability to grow very quickly and have lots of offspring. And that way, it maximizes chances of passing on its genes. If you're a larger animal, the equation changes, because then you have more time and you can produce offspring over a longer period. You have time to find a mate, etc. And so that's really the evolutionary basis for the difference in lifespan, this balance between how much you spend on maintenance and repair and longevity versus how much to spend on growth and reproduction. And it turns out, interestingly, that growth and reproduction are useful early in life, but there's the same pathways that cause aging later in life. So you can also get the phenomenon, and often get the phenomenon, that things that are selected for that give you an advantage early in life actually cause you to age later. And evolution doesn't care, because it wants you to get through the early part so that you can reproduce. And many aging mechanisms evolved perhaps as anti-cancer mechanisms. So things that prevent cancer early in life are often the cause of aging later in life.
What's the oldest that somebody has lived? And you talk about it in the book.
Yeah, so humans, in this graph of size versus lifespan, humans would fall around the sort of 40-year mark. But it turns out we actually live quite a bit longer than where we would be.
The 40-year mark according to our weight and our size.
Yeah, exactly. So for example, a mouse is 2 years, and a Greenland shark or a bowhead whale is, several hundred years. And we ought to be around 30 years or so, but we're actually more than twice that. So in a sense, we're outliers in terms of our falling on that graph. And the human who's lived the longest, the recorded human who's lived the longest, is a French woman named Jeanne Calment, who died in 1997 at the age of 122. And she was quite interesting. So until she was into her hundreds, she smoked a cigarette and had a glass of port every day after lunch. And I wouldn't recommend that. But another one of her habits was that she ate 1 kilo of chocolate every week. And that's something I could probably get behind, actually. And, when she reached her hundreds, she became a kind of phenomenon. So every birthday, reporters would gather around her house to celebrate her birthday. And at one of these birthdays, a journalist said to her, "Well, see you next year, I hope." And she looked at him and she said, "Well, why not? You look pretty good to me."
Everybody's been talking about the Kyoto phenomena and why some of these older people in Japan outlive even the average age. Environment, the system, happiness index, are their cells sort of made differently? Is their DNA stamped different?
It's probably some combination of all of those. So studies on identical twins in Denmark showed that the heritability of aging is about 25%, which means that there's a significant genetic component, but it's not the whole reason. So it's not the length of your life is not entirely or even mostly down to your genes. It's due to some combination. But having said that, there are experiments in animals, especially a worm called C. elegans, which is a favorite of molecular biologists, where a single mutation can double the lifespan of the worm. And it's not a worm that's living twice as long, but doddering around in a wheelchair. But it's actually moving around and quite active. So it's as if it's remaining youthful for a longer period of time. And that created quite a lot of excitement, and it uncovered one of the pathways that's related to caloric restriction, which we could talk about later. But what I'm saying is there is genetic component. So people have studied these centenarians, and they've tried to analyze what is it about them that makes them live longer. And one or two genes seem to show up in studies of centenarians. They're not often, sometimes they're not the same in different studies. And it's not yet clear whether there's a particular combination. I think these centenarians may have many different genetic combinations which in each individual case allowed them to live longer. I also think that many of those genes might have made them at risk earlier on, and these centenarians were simply lucky in that they avoided those risks. I mean, one example is there's a gene called ApoE4, and a variant of that makes you less likely to develop Alzheimer's, and also is overrepresented in centenarians, possibly for the same reason. It's the same thing that makes you less likely to get Alzheimer's is also allowing you to live longer. But it turns out that same variant would make you more susceptible to dying of COVID. It would also make you more susceptible to cancer. So you can see why evolution wouldn't necessarily select for that gene in the population as a whole, because then you would put the population at greater risk earlier on, and you're just counting on luck to get through that and live longer. So it's complicated. I think genetic interventions in aging are going to be fairly complicated.
The other really fascinating thing in your book, you talk about some, like the jellyfish, who sort of then reduces its metabolic activity to ensure that it has a slightly longer lifespan. And this is something that you all have been studying in terms of reversing this thing of aging.
Yeah, so the jellyfish, there are a couple of species that are thought not to age. And what do I mean by that? Well, in normal aging, the probability of your death in the next year, the likelihood of your dying at any given time, rises exponentially. And by this I mean, when you're 10 years old, the chances you'll die of natural causes is almost zero. It's very, very low. However, if you're 90 or 100, the chances of your surviving another year are about 50%. So you can see how the likelihood, or the so-called mortality curve, goes up exponentially with age. Now, it turns out with these jellyfish and this so-called immortal jellyfish and a freshwater animal called the hydra, they don't seem to show this mortality curve. They don't seem to, the chances of aging doesn't increase with time. And what actually it is that the aging is probably very, very slow. It's not that it doesn't happen, because people used to say the same thing about Galapagos tortoises or a rodent called the naked mole rat, which lives for 30 years. But those animals all do, in fact, eventually age. And it's probably true of these as well. But the reason that they appear not to age is that they can replace their cells very readily because they have these cells which are responsible for regeneration called stem cells. And our stem cells are specialized. Their stem cells exist throughout their body and can regenerate tissue at will. This is a bit like when if we lose an arm, we can't regrow an arm. But if you chop off the arm of a starfish, it'll regrow that arm. And so,
or a tail of a lizard.
Or the tail of a lizard. So some animals have that ability to regenerate. And jellyfish and hydra can regenerate the entire organism. In fact, jellyfish, this immortal jellyfish, goes even one step further. If it's under stress, it can actually revert to an earlier form of the jellyfish. So it's almost as if it's aging backwards, metaphorically anyway. And this would be like if you injured a butterfly and it suddenly turned back into a caterpillar. It would be almost like that. So there's some interesting species out there. How relevant they are for us to do something about human aging is not really clear to me, because their physiology and their biology is really quite different.
The other thing you talk about, which I think is, vital for many of us here, is dementia and Alzheimer's, and some of what you say is why that's caused, and what are the ways that can be reversed? Is there a way to reverse it? There's so much medical intervention today that's going on in this area.
I think that reversing
or managing.
Or, well, even slowing down. Neurodegenerative diseases are particularly hard to treat. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is neurons on the whole don't regenerate. There is neurogenesis, that is synthesis of new neurons, but it's a very low level compared to other organs, like our skin or liver or our blood, for example. And so that makes regeneration of nervous tissue difficult. And the other is that it's particularly hard to get things in and out of the brain. Even small molecules are hard to get into the brain, because we have something called the blood-brain barrier, which on purpose tries to keep things out of the brain. And so surmounting that barrier is also hard with therapeutic interventions. And finally, many of the neurodegenerative diseases, the cause is somewhat debated, but I would say the general consensus is that it's due to our own proteins misbehaving and forming tangles of various types. And these tangles then interfere with the ability of our neurons to function and eventually kill them off. And so, because there are our very own proteins, it is hard to, which are misbehaving, it is very hard to come up with treatments, and people are trying to do that. There is a minority opinion which suggests that there may be other causes of Alzheimer's, and these tangles are simply a manifestation rather than the source cause of the disease. But I would say that's still a minority opinion.
Apart from being a really interesting science book, it's got a lot of gossip. Which scientists ran away with whom, who competed with whom, and equally important, who...
I don't know about any running away with anyone.
You had a running away in there. There was one,
forgotten.
yeah. But equally exciting was a whole tribe who dined out on brain, in this case, human brain.
Yeah, so I have to say, many of the real breakthroughs in understanding things like aging or Alzheimer's had their origins in completely unexpected quarters. So I'll come to, perhaps we'll have time to discuss caloric restriction and rapamycin later, which is another interesting story. But you mentioned the 4A tribe. These are the people, indigenous people of Papua New Guinea, of the highlands of Papua New Guinea. And they suffered from a disease. They would get a disease called kuru, in which they would get demented and they would have uncontrollable fits of laughter and demented behavior and then eventually die. And an American scientist named Carlton Gajdusek went to Melbourne, Australia to do a postdoctoral fellowship, and he was sent by his advisor. Well, I think he wanted to go. He was sort of he was a very odd character, and he wanted to go and study these tribal people and find out what was going on. And eventually, and there were others involved as well, but eventually Gajdusek showed that the cause of the disease was because these people were, when their relatives died, they would eat their remains, including their brains, as part of a ritual. And he showed that actually if you took those extracts from diseased individuals and injected them into chimpanzee brains, the chimpanzees would come down with Kuru disease. And that was the first evidence that something like that could be transmitted. And as a result, and now we know that it's possibly related to proteins misfolding and misfunctioning, and it's also happens in, for example, BSE, which was there was an outbreak of BSE or mad cow disease here in Britain, where this had to do with cows being fed the remains of nervous systems of other animals, and then the cows would come down with the disease, and then if you ate the contaminated beef, you could potentially get the disease yourself. And then eventually people understood that the molecular basis for diseases like Alzheimer's might be very similar to this sort of thing. And so for this work, Carlton Gajdusek was awarded a Nobel Prize a few decades ago. And he has the unfortunate distinction of being the only person who both received a Nobel Prize and was a convicted child molester. Because when he went back to the US, he would bring these boys from Papua New Guinea to educate them, but he also had other relations with them. So.
Again, you talk about how your DNA gets stamped and you can pass it on, and the genes, and you talk about the Netherlands famine. What's the consequence of what we're seeing in Palestine today on the kids that are going through these horrific atrocities? Will they then transmit this into the next generation, or is it only about food and protein?
It's, well, I think the cause, so what you're alluding to is that when we undergo stress, say metabolic stress or starvation, we may be actually changing our pattern of gene expression in a semi-permanent way. So we put these marks on our DNA, and it turns out these epigenetic marks, they don't persist over many generations. So they're not, it's not likely to operate as an evolutionary selection mechanism. However, it can persist for a generation or possibly even 2 generations. And so it is possible that, for example, in the Netherlands famine, this is when in the final years of the war, I think it was in 1945, there was a Dutch famine. And when they looked at the children born of mothers who were pregnant during the famine, they found that they had metabolically different, there were large metabolic differences between them versus children born outside of the famine time. And what was even striking is, if the famine occurred when the mother was in the first trimester, the result was different from if the mother was in the third trimester. So clearly, we have changes that we can pass on. Now, what does this have to do with aging? Well, these epigenetic marks on our DNA accumulate with age. And what these marks do is they control the pattern of our expression of genes. And again, these marks may have, the deposition of these marks may have begun as a sort of anti-cancer selection mechanism. So there were things that would prevent you from maybe getting cancer early in life. And then later in life, they may manifest themselves as symptoms of aging because maybe you need those particular genes and which are being shut down and so on. And so people have made very, very good correlation between the pattern of these marks on our DNA and your age. And in many cases, they correlate better with your predictions of mortality or disease, things that are characteristic of old age, than your actual date of birth. So they're better than time as a biological clock. And so many of them are now thinking of using these as some sort of measure of biological age, but that is also somewhat controversial. I think it works very well as a scientific tool and to study populations, but companies that will, charge you £500 to tell you your biological age, I'm not sure how useful that is.
You also talk about obesity, and one of the reasons is that the way we've evolved, and again, hunger in the past.
Yeah, so about a few decades ago, people did careful studies on mice where a controlled group was allowed to eat all it could, and a experimental group was fed just enough calories and nutrients to survive, but not starve. That is, they could survive indefinitely, and they were not losing weight or suffering in any way. And it turned out these calorically restricted mice actually were healthier and lived longer than the mice that could eat all it could. And this kind of experiment has been repeated in many different species, including simple yeast, like baker's yeast. So it's considered a very general pathway. And it's not the story isn't completely hard and fast, because there were experiments done on mice which showed the opposite result, where some strains would actually live less and other strains would live longer when calorically restricted. So that seems to be a contradictory experiment. And another experiment in chimpanzees proved, or actually monkeys, proved quite interesting. And that was that there were two groups, one at the University of Wisconsin and one at NIH, which did these experiments. And the Wisconsin group found quite dramatic differences between calorically restricted monkeys and the all-you-can-eat monkeys. The NIH group found less dramatic differences. So what was why did they have different results? Well, it turned out the Wisconsin group, the control monkeys, were fed a very rich all-you-can-eat diet. And the NIH group gave their control monkeys, they didn't calorically restrict them in that, giving them the bare minimum calories, but they gave them a healthy diet and maybe not all you can eat. And so you could argue that maybe all these experiments are showing is that an all-you-can-eat rich diet is bad for you. So don't gorge all day in an all-you-can-eat buffet, especially on desserts. Okay, so that could be one conclusion. But no matter what your conclusion, it shows that calories and consumption are having an effect on lifespan. And what has happened in the intervening few decades is many of the pathways, some of them identified genetically in worms, all turn out to be related to caloric restriction. So caloric restriction may affect multiple pathways, and some of these pathways have been identified by biologists to be actually involved in aging. And that's leading to the question whether maybe you can interfere with these pathways by some sort of drug and effectively confer the benefits of caloric restriction without actually having to fast or.
How many of you have diabetes and are on metformin? Anybody at metformin? One. Oh, that's a very small whatever. So will she live longer?
There are some people who think so. I think the evidence is a little contradictory. So metformin is, a lot of people are interested in metformin because it's an approved drug. It's the frontline treatment for type 2 diabetes. And what led to excitement was a study that showed that diabetics on metformin were living longer than non-diabetics who are not on metformin. And this was rather surprising because diabetes itself is a risk, as a health risk. And so you wouldn't expect diabetics, even on medication, to live longer than non-diabetics. But this study was contradicted later by other studies which showed no significant effect, and in fact showed that rather it was statins that were really beneficial in terms of mortality. So I think the evidence on metformin is mixed. There's also some side effects of metformin, for example, muscle regeneration and, some of the benefits of exercise are not as strong if you're on metformin. But if you're a diabetic, there's no question of the health benefit, of the risk-benefit ratio. It's much better to be on metformin because diabetes itself is a serious condition and will cause you to age faster and also have all sorts of other, quite bad effects. So for diabetics, there's no question that it's a useful drug. If you're not diabetic and you're perfectly healthy, should you be taking metformin on the idea that, well, it's going to have this effect on insulin sensitivity and things like that and help you age better? Well, there are people who do that. There are even well-known scientists who work on aging who proudly proclaim that they take metformin, but there are no randomized clinical trials which show a beneficial effect. And such trials are being started. There's one famous trial that an aging scientist named Nir Barzilai in New York is trying to conduct to look at the effect of metformin on a healthy population and also monitor carefully the efficacy and also side effects over a long term. But I think we need to wait for those sorts of studies before we could prescribe it for the general population.
I will open it up in a few minutes. Every pressure group tells us red wine, you have to have that, it's going to give you long life, or dark chocolate or whatever, corn flour. Any of these studies have sort of impacted what you've seen?
I don't know, but
it's just a good thing to do.
They've certainly put billions of dollars into the pockets of people who extract money from the worried well. So, I think that's how I would rate them. So the red wine thing comes from the fact that there was an idea that these enzymes called sirtuins were involved in longevity. But subsequent work has really, again, cast doubt on it. Although I should say the original proponents of the sirtuin idea still stick by it. And this red wine is because a compound called resveratrol present in red wine was thought to be a sirtuin activator. And so the idea was that, well, this is the thing that's going to maybe prolong life or make you age more healthily. And subsequently, even people who came from that same original lab have done experiments which cast doubt, first of all, on resveratrol, whether it even activates sirtuin, and later other groups on the whole idea of the sirtuins. Sirtuins are doing something important physiologically, but whether it's related to life healthier aging or extension of life is not at all clear. And I would say the majority of the aging community probably does not believe in that, as far as I can see.
Just have a glass of red wine.
So there'd be papers going back and forth, and I think after one of these papers, an editorial concluded that the best way to enjoy the benefits of red wine is to drink it in moderation.
So Venki, death is a great democratizer, whether you're a Democrat or a tyrant or a self-proclaimed God or a wannabe president, you at the end of the day will die. And yet scientists today want to reverse that. You have billions of dollars going into reversing of aging. Good thing, bad thing, possible?
Okay.
Will we all live forever?
So let's unpack everything you said. First of all, in terms of a democratizer, I should point out that although death is inevitable for all of us, it doesn't come at the same rate. If you're in the top 10% economically in the UK, on average, you'll live about 15 years longer than if you're in the bottom 10%. And of course, not all of this is due to aging. Some of it is due to poor health care, more prone to accidents, diseases, etc. But that's your life expectancy. And in New York City, my stepdaughter is a public health expert in New York. She pointed out that the difference between the richest zip code and the poorest zip code is 35 years, okay? And that may well, I don't know what it is in London postcodes. So it just shows you that these things are maybe democratic at one level, but they're not actually the great equalizers, I think. It's still true that one of the ways you can age well is to be rich, okay? And so now you ask, what happens if we extend lifespan? Well, I should say most of the aging community, the research community, at least will profess that they're not about extending lifespan, but they're about extending the number of healthy years we have in our lives. Whether they can do that without also extending lifespan is not entirely clear to me, okay? Because it could be that they're simply delaying that period of, decline and morbidity. But there is also a movement among some to extend lifespan as well. These are some of these people who simply don't like the idea of dying. Now, I would say, first of all, our natural limit seems to be 120 or so. Nobody since Jean Calment has lived beyond 120 even, although she lived to be 122. And even if she was an outlier, the rest seem to be dying at around 115 or thereabouts, suggesting that 120 might well be an upper limit. And the question is, can we go beyond that? Well, the only way we could go beyond that is if we were able to interfere with the processes of aging itself, all those different causes of aging that I mentioned at different levels. If we can interfere with those in a coordinated way and actually slow down aging, or in the extreme case, even reverse it, perhaps by some sort of reprogramming, then I would say we might be able to breach that barrier. And I'd say there's no physical or chemical law that says we have to die at 120. It's the way we've been selected for by evolution, our species. But other species live much longer. So I think it's theoretically possible, but it's also theoretically possible to do all sorts of things, colonize galaxies or even Mars or something. It doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow. So I think it's very hard. And if it happens, there'll be all sorts of things to worry about. There'll be economic disparities. You would exacerbate the disparities even more if only the rich were able to avail themselves of this. It would also change societies. If people started, or if everyone started living a very long time, it would change societies. Whether it's good or bad, I'm somewhat agnostic. I personally think it wouldn't be such a great idea. I like the idea of turnover and regeneration of ideas and society. And so I'm for that. But against that, there are a couple of arguments. One is the old joke about who would want to live to be 100. And the answer is someone who's 99. Okay? And the other is that people would argue with me, and they would say, look, 150 years ago, we all lived on average about half as long as we do now, and there was lots more turnover. People were having many more children, and they were dying and being replaced. Are you saying that was a better society than what we have now, or aren't you happy that here you are at 70 writing books? Okay, you'd be dead for 30 years, if you were born in India, say 150 years ago. So I think there are multiple sides to this argument.
How many of you would like to live longer than 100 if given an opportunity? 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, how many above 90? How many above 110?
No, you have to.
Oh, there are 3.
No, what you're asking the wrong question. What I'd have to ask you is, how would you like to live to 110, but feel like you're 50? Okay.
Questions. We're going to take just a couple of questions, and so the first one here, second one there, third one on this side, and then we'll come back to Venki. Please, no comments, just questions, because we have 5 minutes.
Yeah,
sure.
So, and this is more of a personal question for me. I suffer from an autoimmune disorder, which is caused by one of the genes, ILB1. And it's quite morbid for me. My question for you is, I was reading your book, and wherein you talk about acetylation of histamines. In the context of what's going on in the latest medicine, I've been offered 3 choices. One is sort of gene therapy, CRISPR. One is monoclonal antibodies. And one is to do with kinase receptor blockers. In your opinion, which of those 3 hold the best?
So hold that.
I have to tell you, I'm not a doctor, and I know absolutely nothing really about autoimmune diseases except that's your immune system reacting to your own proteins. So I would really rely on expert advice for that. I'm sorry.
Next question.
Yeah.
Dr. Venki, you spoke about proteins tangling, unfolding, misfolding. Is there any room for dying of heartbreak? And where is the space for EQ, emotional quotients? Does that even matter?
Well, you raise an interesting question, which is, does our mental state affect our physiology? And that's the so-called mind-body, the sort of brain interaction with the rest of the body. And that's very well established. And it is true that if you're under stress, your physiology changes in a way that's detrimental. And if you're happy, you probably have beneficial effects. I think stress is known to reduce life. It's known to accelerate aging in many ways. There are even studies which show that stress can accelerate shortening of your chromosomes through telomere loss, which is one of the causes of aging. But stress probably has multiple ways in which it affects aging through hormones interacting with many pathways. So I think there's almost certainly going to be some effect, but I'm not sure you can quantify it.
Hi, that was an excellent session, Venki, and I'm going to ask a question which is an extension to what Sanjoy asked. Obviously, it's here. I'm here. Oh. So there's been, like I said, lots of billions of dollars spent on this, but specifically in the tech bro elements of the leaders of the industry who are now looking at the quest for immortality, you cannot have a session like this without finishing about Brian Johnson. So what's your view of Brian Johnson, which is the most publicized exercise of anti-aging and immortality, where he's injecting himself with various components of what his children and his grandchildren. I mean, what's your view on all of that? How successful is that likely to be?
Yeah, so Brian Johnson was in the news because there were studies on animals that showed if you connected an old with a young animal, the old animal would benefit from the blood of the young animal, and the young animal would actually suffer from blood of the old animal. And this led to the idea that in younger blood, there are factors which actually may help you with aging, and we lose those factors as we age. And of course, this is real science, and there's a lot of scientific research now trying to understand how young blood and old blood differ, what are the factors, how does it prevent, or how does it alleviate some of the symptoms of aging and confer benefits, etc. And that's an ongoing and complicated research effort done in labs all over the world. But as soon as these reports came out, it didn't stop companies from sprouting up all over the place, and they would get young donors to contribute blood, and then they would take that blood and sell it at a markup to rich recipients. And so there were all these transplant clinics, and one of them was shut down by the FDA and then sprouted up under a different name. And the CEO went on to say, well, when asked about clinical trials, he said, look, the trouble is clinical trials take too long, and our customers don't want to wait. And so that was the attitude. And Brian Johnson is a tech billionaire who seems to be obsessed with aging. And his whole motto is don't die, don't age. And he spends about, this is all hearsay, he spends about $2 million a year on various anti-aging measures, including measuring all sorts of parameters, all sorts of data about himself. And he, for a while, got transfusions from his son, and then he donated blood to his father, this sort of intergenerational transfer, keeping it all in the family. And then I think his markers didn't seem to improve, so he basically decided it wasn't quite working. Although he said he still believes in the principle of it. And there I do agree with him, because the original data are still true, and we need to find out what makes them work. And then eventually there might be a way in which they could be put to some good use.
I'm sorry, we've run out of time. I've been given the timeout. So, amazing session. It's difficult to unpack such a brilliant book by Sir Venki. But I am going to ask him for one last thought. You talk about in any scientific endeavor and research, apart from the intent, hard work, etc., there's also the element of accident and luck.
Yeah, so many of these, I try to give the history of many of these fields. And what strikes me is that many of them came from completely unexpected quarters, not by people who are studying aging at all. And they came about by a result of chance encounters or random, accidental occurrences, and also by very brilliant scientists who are following some fundamental question and pursuing it without really any idea that one day it would have some effect on aging research.
Ladies and gentlemen, Sir Venki Ramakrishnan, he'll be signing his book, Nobel Laureate. And for those of you traveling out to India for the Jaipur Literature Festival in January, he'll be speaking there 30th Jan to 3rd of February. Thank you so much.